For most football fans, Switzerland is not the team they circle before a World Cup. They are not surrounded by global hype. They do not dominate social media. Their players rarely become the faces of major advertising campaigns. And when people discuss potential contenders, Switzerland often disappears from the conversation before it even begins. That might be exactly what makes them dangerous, because while the football world debates the obvious threats, Switzerland keeps doing something strange. They keep surviving, they keep advancing, they keep frustrating teams that are supposed to be better than them, and every few years, another heavily favored opponent walks into a tournament match believing Switzerland will be manageable. Then 90 minutes later, they leave wondering what just happened. The mystery isn't why Switzerland occasionally causes problems. The mystery is why people keep acting surprised when they do, because at some point, a pattern stops being an accident. It becomes an identity, and Switzerland may have built one of the most uncomfortable identities in international football, an identity that bigger nations hate facing, an identity that fans rarely appreciate, an identity that could make them one of the most dangerous teams at the World Cup, not because they are the most talented, not because they are the most famous, but because they understand something many teams never do. Sometimes the greatest advantage in football is being ignored. At first glance, Switzerland does not look threatening. That's part of the problem. Football fans are conditioned to look for certain signs: superstars, massive fan bases, historic rivalries, endless media coverage. Switzerland rarely checks those boxes. When tournament predictions begin, discussions quickly move toward the traditional giants: Brazil, Argentina, France, Germany, England, Spain, Portugal. The spotlight naturally follows those nations. Every decision becomes a headline. Every injury becomes a national story. Every mistake becomes a crisis. The pressure is constant. The expectations are relentless. And while those countries spend months answering questions about whether they can win the tournament, Switzerland quietly prepares for something else entirely: how to make life miserable for whoever stands in front of them. That may sound simple, it isn't, because international football is filled with talented teams. Talent alone rarely separates nations anymore. The margins have become smaller, the differences have become thinner, and in that environment, organization becomes a weapon, discipline becomes a weapon, patience becomes a weapon. Switzerland has spent years building their reputation around those qualities. The problem for opponents is that those qualities are difficult to measure. You can see a world-class striker, you can see a creative midfielder, you can see a goalkeeper making spectacular saves, but organization is harder to notice until it starts suffocating you, until every passing lane disappears, until every attack becomes slower, until frustration begins replacing confidence. And by the time opponents realize what's happening, Switzerland is already controlling the emotional rhythm of the match. That is where their true danger begins, not in the tactics, in the psychology, because Switzerland rarely tries to overwhelm teams. They try to outlast them. There is a difference. Many national teams enter major tournaments believing they must impose themselves immediately. They attack aggressively, they chase momentum, they force situations. Switzerland often appears comfortable doing the opposite. They wait, they observe, they absorb pressure, and that patience creates a strange effect. The longer matches remain close, the more uncomfortable favorites become. Every missed opportunity feels larger, every wasted attack feels heavier. Every minute increases the tension. Suddenly, the underdog isn't carrying the pressure anymore. The favorite is. And that is exactly where Switzerland wants them, because pressure changes people. Pressure changes decisions. Pressure changes teams. The history of the World Cup is filled with talented squads that collapsed under expectations, not because they lacked ability, because they lost emotional control. Switzerland understands this. They understand that football matches are rarely won by the team with the most confidence before kickoff. They are often won by the team with the most composure when things become difficult. And few teams remain calm quite like Switzerland. That calmness is not accidental. It comes from experience. Year after year, tournament after tournament, Switzerland keeps finding themselves in demanding situations, tight matches, high-pressure moments, hostile atmospheres, penalty shootouts, do-or-die scenarios. Those experiences leave scars, but they also create resilience. The football world often celebrates dramatic victories. What receives less attention is the ability to stay functional when everything feels chaotic. Switzerland has quietly become specialists at exactly that, and perhaps that explains why bigger nations frequently leave matches against them feeling frustrated, because Switzerland forces opponents into a different kind of game, a psychological game, a game where impatience becomes dangerous, a game where one mistake can undo an hour of dominance, a game where reputation suddenly means nothing. For favorites, that can be terrifying, because the things that normally make them powerful become less effective. Their talent still exists, their stars still exist, but Switzerland refuses to be intimidated by any of it, and when intimidation disappears, football becomes much more unpredictable. There is another reason Switzerland remains difficult to understand. Most football narratives rely on extremes. Teams are either contenders or underdogs, successful or unsuccessful, dominant or disappointing. Switzerland exists somewhere in between, and because of that, they often escape attention. They are rarely bad enough to become a crisis, rarely spectacular enough to dominate headlines. They operate in football's shadows, consistently present, consistently competitive, consistently overlooked, yet that middle ground can be deceptive, because while other nations experience dramatic rises and dramatic falls, Switzerland continues building stability. Stability is not exciting, but stability wins matches. Stability survives tournaments, and stability becomes increasingly valuable when pressure starts destroying other teams. Looking back, the warning signs have been visible for years. Every time Switzerland entered a tournament, people questioned whether they truly belonged among stronger nations. Every time they advanced, the conversation briefly changed. Then it returned to normal. The cycle repeated itself. Doubt, performance, respect, forgetting, doubt again. It is one of the strangest patterns in international football, almost as if the football world refuses to learn from its own experiences. And perhaps Switzerland prefers it that way, because attention comes with consequences. The more expectations increase, the more complicated football becomes. Players face greater scrutiny, managers face greater criticism, mistakes become national discussions, every decision feels heavier. Switzerland avoids much of that. Their players can focus on football instead of narratives. Their coaches can focus on preparation instead of managing public hysteria. Their dressing room remains insulated from many distractions that consume larger football nations. That freedom matters, especially during a World Cup, because tournaments are emotional marathons. The teams that survive are not always the most talented. Sometimes they are simply the teams best equipped to handle the emotional demands. And Switzerland enters tournaments carrying something few favorites possess. Freedom. Freedom from impossible expectations. Freedom from constant judgment. Freedom from the belief that anything less than a trophy equals failure. That psychological advantage cannot be measured on paper, but it becomes visible when matches become tense. One team is terrified of losing. The other is focused on competing. Those are very different mental states, and Switzerland has repeatedly benefited from that difference. Of course, there are skeptics. There always are. The argument is familiar. If Switzerland is truly dangerous, why aren't they winning tournaments? Why aren't they reaching every semifinal? Why aren't they dominating world football? It's a reasonable question, but it may also miss the point. The real threat of Switzerland is not that they are guaranteed to win. The threat is that they are capable of ruining someone else's dream. And at a World Cup, that can be just as important, because tournaments are often remembered for unexpected exits. The giant that fell, the favorite that collapsed, the contender that never saw danger coming. Switzerland has become one of the teams most capable of creating those stories. Not through chaos, not through luck, but through discipline, through patience, through relentless emotional control. That combination makes them incredibly difficult to eliminate, and perhaps even more difficult to predict, because unlike teams built around one superstar, Switzerland's strength is collective. There is no single player opponents can neutralize to solve the problem. There is no obvious weakness to target, no clear shortcut to victory. Everything feels connected, everything feels organized, everything feels intentional. That structure creates another challenge. When teams face football giants, motivation arrives automatically. Everyone knows the threat. Everyone understands the stakes. Against Switzerland, that urgency sometimes arrives too late. Opponents believe opportunities will eventually appear. That control will eventually arrive. That goals will eventually come. Then suddenly the match is nearing its conclusion. The score remains close. Pressure is growing, and panic starts creeping into places where confidence once lived. By then, Switzerland has already achieved something important. They have turned the match into a test of mentality, and mentality is where tournaments are often decided. What makes this story fascinating is that Switzerland's greatest weapon may actually be invisibility, not literal invisibility, narrative invisibility, the ability to exist outside the main conversation, the ability to prepare without constant scrutiny, the ability to improve without attracting headlines, the ability to surprise people who should no longer be surprised. Most dangerous teams announce themselves. Switzerland rarely does. They arrive quietly, they compete relentlessly, and they leave opponents with uncomfortable questions. questions about preparation, questions about assumptions, questions about why a match that looked straightforward became so difficult. Those questions tend to linger, especially after elimination, especially after disappointment, especially after dreams disappear. And that is why Switzerland remains such a fascinating World Cup story, because they challenge one of football's biggest assumptions, the assumption that danger is always obvious. Sometimes danger wears a different face. Sometimes danger doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes danger isn't the team everyone fears. It's the team nobody talks about, the team nobody prioritizes, the team nobody notices until the pressure becomes unbearable. Years from now, Switzerland may never be remembered as the loudest team of their era. They may never become the most celebrated. They may never dominate documentaries or headlines the way football's traditional giants do. But that isn't necessarily their role. Their role is something far more uncomfortable: to remind football that reputation does not guarantee safety, to remind favorites that talent does not guarantee control, to remind tournaments that discipline can challenge glamour, and to remind the world that overlooking an opponent can be the most dangerous mistake of all. Because the most threatening teams are not always the ones standing in the spotlight. Sometimes they're standing just outside it, waiting, organized, patient, composed, watching everyone else chase attention, watching everyone else carry expectations, watching everyone else absorb pressure. And then, when the tournament reaches its most fragile moments, they quietly step forward. Not as the team everyone predicted, not as the team everyone feared, but as the team nobody truly understood. And by the time the football world realizes the threat was real, it may already be too late.